She had eaten at his table 11 times since the wedding, and not once had he asked her name. She knows this because she has counted. Elara counts everything. She counts the candles burning in the dining room on any given evening. Tonight there are 14, and 3 of them are running low, the wax forming pale trails down the silver holders that nobody has come to replace. She counts the distance between her chair and his, which she once paced out on a Tuesday morning when the house was empty. 22 feet of Aubusson carpet, of polished mahogany, of silence that has never once been filled by anything resembling conversation. She counts the number of times he has truly looked at her, not the managed glance of a man acknowledging a presence in the room. And that number, until this evening, was 0. Tonight it is 1. She does not reach for the salt. She has been doing what she always does at this table, watching him from behind the careful arrangement of her face, deciding what his silence means. She is very good at deciding what things mean. She has had to be. It is the only inheritance her father left her that could not be seized. He asked her to pass the salt, such a small thing, and when he said it, he looked not at the salt cellar but at her. For perhaps 2 seconds, something shifted behind his eyes, some recognition of a person where before there had only been a function, and Elara felt it the way you feel change in temperature, not dramatically, but undeniably. She passed the salt. He thanked her and looked away, and now she sits at her end of this too large table, spine perfectly straight, hands folded in her lap beneath the linen, doing what she has rehearsed for weeks, the stillness, the silence, the patience, and she is not certain she can survive him beginning to see her, because she knows exactly who he is. And he has never once thought to ask who she might be. You have just met her, composed, careful, sitting 20 feet from the man who changed the course of her life. She knows everything, he knows nothing, and somewhere between that dinner table and everything that comes after, this story will ask whether a wound can be avenged without reopening it, whether justice and proximity can live in the same house, whether a woman who came with a plan can be undone by the truth. If you are new to Whispered Thrones, this is where stories like this live, long ones, layered ones, told the way they deserve to be. Subscribe if you have not yet, and come back every week. Now let me take you back to where this began. The morning Elara Voss received word about the Duke of Ashmore's search for a wife, she was sitting at the kitchen table in her coat. The coat is important. It was January, and they could not afford to heat the house before 7, and Elara had been awake since 5:30. Not from habit, but from a low, steady dread that had become indistinguishable from her ordinary state of consciousness since her father died. She sat in the coat and opened her ledger and moved the same small column of figures from one side of the page to the other, looking for an arrangement that would make the number larger than it was. The number never became larger, but she kept looking because looking was the only form of control available to her. Her father had taught her to keep accounts. Thomas Voss had been meticulous about money, not in the way of miserly men, but in the way of men who have built something real and understand that the difference between solvency and ruin lives in the details. He had a cloth merchant's warehouse on the river at Gloucester, built over 30 years. Trade route by trade route, fair dealing by fair dealing. He had shown Elara how to keep the accounts before she was 12 years old. The accounts from the last 2 years of his life told a different story. In 1812, the land agent of the Ashmore estate began acquiring the surrounding leases on the river quarter of Gloucester. A purchase here, a renewal declined there. New terms imposed on existing arrangements that made continuation impossible. Within 18 months, the warehouse Thomas Voss had built across 3 decades was cut off from its primary trade route. He died in 1814. The physician said his heart. His family said they knew what had broken first. Elara's mother took to her bed shortly after, and had not, in any meaningful sense, left it since. Her younger sister, Clara, was 17 and bright, and deserved better than the careful management of a dwindling life. Elara was the thing between all of them, and the kind of poverty that does not stabilize at difficult but continues quietly until difficult becomes impossible. The letter from her aunt, Mrs. Cora Felton, arrived on a Tuesday. Mrs. Felton was connected to London drawing rooms by virtue of a dead husband's distant acquaintances, and she had written to say the Duke of Ashmore was seeking a wife. Not a debutante, not an heiress, a woman of quiet manners and no conspicuous past, a woman who would not make demands. Elara read the letter twice. Then she sat for a long time with her hands flat on the table, the way she always sat when the thing happening was too large to respond to immediately. Then she picked up her pen and wrote back to her aunt. She did not think of it as romance. She thought of it as a door. She had been looking for one for 2 years. His Grace, William Cavendish Roke, the 7th Duke of Ashmore, was at that same moment in his estate library, crossing out a line item in a quarterly ledger. The library at Ashmore Hall had been designed to communicate the weight of the Cavendish-Roke family's accumulated authority. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls. The desk was enormous, positioned with its back to the south window so that anyone sitting across from it was slightly blinded by the light, while the man behind it remained in shadow. The room arranged itself around the Duke's perspective. William had inherited this desk at 25. He had learned from his father that management was strategy and sentiment was weakness, and he applied both lessons efficiently. He was not an unkind man, precisely. He was a man who conducted his life at a significant remove from its consequences, and the remove had become so habitual he no longer noticed it. He crossed out the line item, a small tenant subsidy, £40, with a single stroke, and did not pause his conversation with Mr. Forsyth about the drainage plans for the Northfield. He did not know the £40 represented a family's margin. Reading the specific context of line items was not his practice. He approved categories, approved totals, trusted his proxies to manage the details. When Forsyth raised a mild concern about the subsidy cut, William said without looking up, "That is a ledger problem, not a human problem. Solve it at the ledger." He was not being cruel. He was being automatic, which was in certain ways worse. This is the man Elara was planning to marry. She did not know about the £40 or the Northfield. What she knew was the name on the estate that had made her father's trade route impossible, and that name was Ashmore. She had not, in 5 years of carrying that name like a stone in her chest, permitted herself to picture the face behind it. Faces complicated things. Faces made it harder to be precise. The drawing room of Mrs. Cora Felton's Marylebone townhouse was the kind of room that tried very hard. The china was excellent. The cushions had been recently beaten. A small fire burned in the grate, despite the day being mild, which told Elara that someone had been nervous about the impression the room would make. That someone was Mrs. Felton, who had been managing the arrangement of every small object since 9 in the morning. Elara was sitting in the chair by the window, not because the light was pleasant, but because it gave her the fullest view of the room's entrance. Without appearing to watch the door, she was watching the door. She had composed her expression, her posture, and her hands into something that communicated exactly what she intended. A woman present, correct and unhurried. She had expected the land agent. The arrangement was to be conducted through Mr. Forsyth, which told Elara something about the Duke already. He managed even this through proxies. So when Forsyth entered, and then, behind him, a second man, a man whose presence reconfigured the entire weight of the room the moment he stepped into it, Elara permitted herself 1 second of recalibration. No more. The second ticks, and then the arrangement of your face simply does not change. She had seen his portrait once, in the Gloucester Guildhall, when her father brought her to a function there. Her father had pointed to it, and said something she could no longer fully recall. Something about the power that accrued to men who inherited rather than built, and she had looked at the portrait and thought, he looks like a wall. She had not looked at it again. She looked at him now. He was younger than she had expected. The portrait had rendered him in the flattened grandeur of official portraiture, but the man in front of her was more textured. There were lines around his eyes that spoke less of authority than of tiredness, the specific tiredness of a person who has been managing something difficult for a long time and has not permitted themselves to put it down. She had seen those lines in her own face. In the mornings before the fire caught, she had been counting on something clean, useful and clean. Duke of Ashmore, liability, cause of harm. What she had not accounted for was the particular quality of his stillness, not the stillness of a powerful man with no need to perform, but of a man who had stopped performing because it had grown too heavy and found that stillness was the only thing underneath. This cost her something. She would be angrier about it later. They went through the correct forms. Tea was produced. William sat across from her at the precise angle that suggested interested but not eager. The angle of a man conducting even the most personal transaction from a managed distance. He did not perform. That was what she kept returning to afterward. Every other man she had observed in these arrangements had performed, made gestures toward warmth or authority, depending on what the occasion required. William Cavendish-Roke simply sat there, in the uncomfortable way of a man not entirely certain what he was doing, which she had not expected. Near the end of the meeting, Forsyth had moved to speak with Mrs. Felton, and William turned to Elara and said something entirely outside the grammar of these arrangements. "Do you want this, Miss Voss?" A pause. Not whether it is suitable, whether you want it. No one had asked her this before. The question assumed she was capable of wanting, which was a form of recognition she had not budgeted for. She held his gaze for 3 seconds and then said, "I want what follows from it, Your Grace." It was not a lie. It was also not the answer he asked for. He looked at her for a moment longer, reading something in her face he had not finished reading. Then he nodded, and the meeting moved on, and she could not tell if he had understood her or simply decided not to pursue it. She thought about that nod for the next 2 weeks. They were married at the end of November. The ceremony was correct and brief. William placed the ring on her finger with the precision of a man completing a legal transaction, which is what it was, and she accepted it focused entirely on what came next. What came next was Ashmore Hall. 40 rooms, 26 staff. Corridors that stretched to distances requiring decision, which way to turn. Elara walked through it on her first day as its mistress and catalogued everything with the attention of a woman who understood that knowledge was the only security she currently held. She found the Duchess's writing table, the household accounts, the correspondence that crossed her desk as a matter of domestic management, and she began, in the careful way she did everything, to look. She was not entirely certain what she was looking for. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in the 4th week of her marriage, a letter slid into the correspondence pile, addressed to a solicitor from Forsyth, and in the process of initialing and redirecting it, she read one sentence. The Voss matter concluded in 1812, no obligation outstanding. She set the letter down. She read it again. Concluded, not unfortunate, not regrettable. Concluded. A matter like a ledger entry, crossed out and moved on from. Her father's 30 years of fair trade, her mother's failing health, her sister's diminished prospects, her own mornings in the coat by candlelight, concluded. No obligation outstanding. She sat for a long time with her hands flat on the table. Then she initialed the letter, redirected it, and permitted herself exactly 2 minutes alone in her sitting room. Then she stopped. She needed to find the archive. Now, you are deep into this story, and I want to ask you something before we go further. Have you ever been in a room carrying information the other person did not know you had? Have you felt the weight of what is not being said pressing as against the underside of a conversation? Because that is every room Elara walks into, every meal, every corridor, every polite exchange. She is never not carrying it. I want you to feel that, because what she is about to find will change everything, and the weight of it will only make sense if you have been carrying it with her. The estate archive was in the east wing, through a door that had not been oiled recently. She borrowed the key from the housekeeper on the pretext of reviewing household inventories, and spent 2 hours in the land management files, finding the operational record of the Voss consolidation, documented with efficiency, outcomes only, no objections noted. She was replacing the files when she noticed, on the shelf below, boxes labelled in a different hand. Personal correspondence, 1810 to 1815. She almost left them. She had what she needed. The damage was documented. She did not leave them. She was Elara Voss, and accounts are only useful if they are complete. The letter was in the third box, written in a hand that was younger and more tightly controlled than the surrounding documents, as though the writer was working to contain the urgency of what he was saying. Addressed to Forsyth, dated the autumn of 1812. The merchant at the river quarter is to be left undisturbed. He has operated that trade fairly for 30 years. Do not touch the Voss lease. The signature was W. Cavendish Roke. She read it twice, then a third time. She set it down and did not move. Outside she could hear the distant sound of horses, William returning from the fields, the ordinary sound of a man coming home to his ordinary house, which was also her house, which was also the house where his father had overridden his explicit instruction and destroyed a family he had tried to protect. She had spent 5 years certain of her target. The target had just dissolved. The Ashmore winter gathering was 3 days of county society examining the new Duchess. Elara managed it with the same precision she brought to everything. She learned names, remembered connections, said exactly the right thing at exactly the right frequency to signal warmth without inviting intimacy. On the second afternoon, Lady Brentmore sat down at the card table beside her. Sharp-eyed and comfortable in her own authority, she mentioned over the third hand of whist that she recalled a merchant family from Gloucester named Voss, who had come to a sad end some years ago. She said it looking at her cards. Then she looked up directly at Elara. Elara did not flinch. She deployed the specific quality of polite incomprehension she had prepared. A sad end. How unfortunate. Lady Brentmore held her gaze 1 beat longer than was strictly social. Then she looked back at her cards and said, "Indeed, a good family, I always thought, but there it is." From the other end of the table, William did not look up. He appeared not to have heard. Elara could not be certain, and the not knowing sat in her chest for the remainder of the evening like something with edges. 3 days later, a letter from her aunt. Her mother had declined. A specialist from London was required. The cost was beyond what Elara had quietly retained from the household funds. She went to William's study. She told him her mother required a physician from London. He looked up from his desk and said, without hesitation, "Of course, give Forsyth the amount and it will be arranged." Then he returned to his correspondence. She stood in his doorway a moment longer than she needed to. She had prepared for resistance, for negotiation, for the specific reluctance of a powerful man extending resources to a woman he considered a domestic convenience. She had not prepared for, of course. The ease of it, the absence of ceremony, was somehow the thing she could least absorb. She was angrier than she had been since arriving in this house, and she understood why. It was easy for him. It had always been easy for him, and it had never, not once, been easy for her. And the gap between those two facts was the precise size of what had been done to her family. Later that evening, returning to her room, she passed the corridor outside the east sitting room. The door was not fully closed, she heard Pemberton ask, in the intimate tone of men who believe they are unobserved, whether the marriage had been a satisfactory arrangement. She stopped. She stood 3 feet from the door and did not breathe. William said, "She is precisely what was required, quiet, capable, no complications." She walked to her room. She sat at her writing table. She opened her ledger and looked at the figures she moved from column to column every morning. She closed the ledger. She put both hands flat on the table and breathed slowly, the way she had taught herself to breathe when the thing happening was too large to respond to immediately. And then she cried. She had not permitted herself to cry since the night after her father's funeral, when she understood for the first time the weight of being the one who holds things together. Tonight she cried for exactly as long as the pressure required. Then she wiped her face, opened the ledger, and took out a clean sheet of paper. She wrote 3/4 of a letter to the Gloucester solicitor who had represented her father. Then she stopped. It was precise, documented, legally coherent. It would do damage, to Forsyth certainly, to the estate's reputation possibly, to William uncertainly. She folded it. She did not send it. She placed it in her ledger and locked the ledger in her writing table. She did not know whether not sending it was wisdom or cowardice. She suspected both. Now I need you to be very present. Everything in this story has been building to the next conversation. A woman like Elara has spent her entire adult life managing her truth into legisized portions, containable, organized, never larger than she can carry. What is about to happen is not contained. On the last morning of the house party, Elara walked in the frost-covered garden after breakfast. The garden was grey and still, the frost having done to the hedges what cold does to things, reduced them to their essential shapes, stripped of pretense. Lady Brentmore appeared from the garden gate. She said she had known Thomas Voss of Gloucester, that she had always liked him. Then she said she had also known the late Duke, William's father, and had always found him a man of considerable intelligence and considerable private vindictiveness. She said the Voss lease matter was not purely economic strategy. There had been a rival in the wool trade whose supply chain ran through Voss's warehouse. The old Duke had wanted that man ruined, and Voss had been used. Thomas Voss was not the target, he was the mechanism. He was destroyed so that someone else could be destroyed through him. Lady Brentmore said it was a shame, patted Elara's arm, and walked back to the house. Elara stood alone in the frost. Her father had not been important enough to be the target. He had been too convenient to be spared. He was collateral in a private war that had nothing to do with him, fought by a man already in his grave, through the machinery of an estate now managed by a son who had tried, at 24, to write a letter telling his father's agent to leave the merchant at the river alone. She stood until she was absolutely certain of what she was about to do. 3 days later, the house had settled back into itself. The guests were gone. The staff moved through their routines. Elara moved through her days, not eating much, sleeping badly, carrying in the way she had always carried things the full weight of what she had decided. On Thursday evening, she took the folded letter from her ledger. She walked downstairs. The library door was open. The fire was low. William was at his desk, head bent over correspondence, a candle burning close to his right hand. The house was entirely quiet. She walked in. She set the letter on his desk. He looked up. She said her name was Elara Voss, that Thomas Voss of Gloucester was her father, that she had watched a man who spent 30 years building something honest have it unmade in 18 months, not by misfortune, but by the administrative decisions of this estate. She said this without raising her voice and without looking away. She told him about the mornings with the ledger and the coat and the candle, about her mother in the bed and her sister with no prospects, about the portrait in the Guildhall and her father pointing to it, and what he had said that she could no longer fully remember, and how that half-lost memory was somehow the thing she had carried longest. She told him the architecture of what she had planned dissolved in an archive room on a Tuesday afternoon, and she had not been able to rebuild it since. She told him she had found his letter. She said, "I do not know what to do with the fact that you tried to stop it. I have spent 5 years hating a story, and I have spent 7 weeks inside the man the story was about, and I cannot reconcile them. So I am telling you the truth, because I am no longer willing to be the only person in this house who carries it." She did not ask for anything. She did not weep. She stood on her side of the desk with her hands at her sides, and she waited. The fire made small sounds. The candle burned steady. He looked at his own letter, dated 1812, in his own handwriting, and he read it the way a man reads something he has not let himself remember. He did not look away from it quickly. Then he stood, not toward her and not away. He stood in the particular way of a man who no longer knows which direction is forward, who has had the map of his own life presented in a form he did not construct, and cannot immediately orient himself within. He said, very quietly, "I knew the name Voss. I did not make the connection." A pause so complete that the fire seemed to stop crackling during it. "I should have made the connection." It was not an apology. It was the first true thing he had said to her in 7 weeks, and she felt it land somewhere she had not known was waiting to receive it. He did not sleep that night. In the morning he sent for Forsyth by express rider, not for the next quarterly review but immediately, which was not how William did things. He demanded the full Voss file and read every word of it, not a summary. He found the confirmation, the private rivalry, his father's use of Thomas Voss as a mechanism, Forsyth's record that reflected outcomes only, and buried the objections of a 24-year-old man who could not yet override his father's agent. When he came back to Elara, he came to her sitting room. He stood in the doorway and said, "Your father was used and discarded by my father in a private quarrel that had nothing to do with him. The estate that bears my name did that. I did not order it, that is the truth. The truth does not undo it." She looked at him for a long time, watching him stand in her doorway like a man still learning which rooms he is permitted to enter, and she could not separate what she felt into its component parts. She let it remain whole and unnamed. He wrote, in his own hand, a formal acknowledgment of the Ashmore estate's role in the dissolution of Thomas Voss's trade, and attached to it a private settlement for her mother and sister, requiring nothing of Elara in return. Not framed as compensation, which would have implied the debt could be paid. He called it a reckoning with the ledger. He gave it to her with no ceremony, no audience, no social benefit to himself. She recognized her own word. She recognized that he had been listening more carefully than he appeared to. She recognized this as its own form of confession. Forsyth was removed from service that spring, quietly, with a settlement sufficient to prevent destitution and insufficient to reward 2 decades of proxy management. Lady Brentmore received a warm letter from the Duchess of Ashmore, thanking her for the loveliest conversation in the Frost Garden. She was delighted and had not the faintest idea why. Elara's mother received the London specialist. The prognosis was better than expected. Not recovery, but stability, and stability is its own form of mercy when you have been watching precariousness long enough. Clara's future opened possibility by possibility, each one real. Elara herself did not transform. She did not become warm when she had been cool, trusting when she had been precise. She was not rewritten by what had happened. She was the same woman carrying less. She found that William had developed the habit of appearing in whatever room she occupied, in the library, when she was reading, at the far end of the drawing room, when she sat near the fire. He was learning, in the clumsy way of a man who has spent his life managing distance, how to be present. He was visiting his tenant properties, reading correspondence in full before approving it. The Northfield family's subsidy appeared restored in the next quarterly accounting, the line item written back without announcement. She knew because the household accounts crossed her desk. She was, after all, the Duchess of Ashmore. On a morning in February, with the fires properly lit and frost retreating from the windows, Elara sat at her writing table. The candle beside her burned for light, not warmth. She opened her ledger to the page where she had always moved the same small figures from column to column, looking for a way to make them larger than they were. The columns were different now. The figures were different. She looked at them for a long time. Then she wrote a single line and closed the book. The narration will not tell you what she wrote, but her coat was hanging on its hook by the door, and she had not needed to put it on. This was never really a story about a marriage. It was a story about a woman who learned that the truth, told in the right room at the right moment, is its own form of power, one that cannot be seized, leased, or managed away. She came carrying a grievance that was real, and a plan that was brittle, and a heart armoured in the way hearts get armoured when they have been treated as ledger entries. What she found, at the end of all that precision, was something she had not budgeted for, a man capable of standing in the wreckage of what his family had done and not looking away. That is what you came for, I think. You came because you know what it is to carry something that was not your fault, and be asked anyway to manage it quietly. Elara did not manage it quietly. She set the letter on the desk. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Whispered Thrones. New stories every week, long ones, layered ones, ones that do not end where you expect. And if you do not subscribe, you will have to live with never knowing what is waiting in the next one. I will consider that your debt to me. Wherever you are tonight, I hope your ledger is balanced, and I hope someone has made the connection.